side we are waiting. Be born in our song. We long for justice here. Rise up, love eternal within our hearts. Rise up, love eternal on this city block. Side by side we are waiting. Be born in our song. We long for justice here. Rise up, hope eternal within our hearts. Rise up, hope eternal on this city block. Side by side we are waiting. Be born in our song. We long for justice here. Levanta paz eterna en nuestra comunidad. Levanta paz eterna en esta ciudad. Hombro a la espera. Nacer en la canción. Anhelamos la justicia aquí. Rise up, peace eternal within our hearts. Rise up, peace eternal on this city block. Side by side we are waiting. Be born in our song. We long for justice here.
Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to this Ecumenical Advocacy Days. Today's panel, I am Dr. Manoj Kurian. I coordinate the WCC Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance, and I'm based in Geneva. And I have with me an eminent panel whom I will introduce. I just want to start introducing the topic. The topic for the panel theme is nutrition, equity, and sustainability, and the impact of violence and militarism on all these points. We know that the theme for the conference is Micah 4:3. But soon after the theme of that verse, there is another verse which says that every man and woman would sit under his or her own vine and under his or her own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. So the sustainability is linked to, of course, peace and the ability to develop peace needs an enabling environment. So setting the scene, I would just give a few pointers, point you to that there is tremendous impact of conflict and war and peace towards the access of food for all people. But you can take the look. You can look at what's happening in Ukraine. The conflict has actually increased global prices, but most of all, the conflict has displaced about 10 million people from Ukraine itself, and that adds up to nearly 100 million people. That is 1 in 72 people who are in the world who is displaced. So the important point here is that conflicts is actually displacing millions of people from their homes, and that means that they cannot harvest, they cannot cultivate. But why are these conflicts happening? Many times these conflicts are happening due to tremendous problems which our panelists will raise. It could be inability to live in those places. It could be because of agricultural situations. It could be because of climate change. It could be because of tremendous greed of humanity. Look at Democratic Republic of Congo, among the most fertile lands in the world. The Democratic Republic of Congo is bigger than the whole of Western Europe. And the population of about 100 million people are suffering tremendously, not because of lack of resources, but because of the resources and because of the greed of people to exploit those resources, and which sows confusion and conflicts, because it provides a lot of the precious metals, and this is exploited by people who are not looking at peace, and they have contributed to destroying the systems. And same thing when you look at Central America. Why has there been no ability for communities to have food? It's because many of the places, the global system has replaced the ability to grow their own food, and has forced the countries and the people to grow cash crops, be it bananas or coffee or soya bean, so that they can feed the whole industrial agricultural system. And then, of course, it's linked to trade. And when the price collapses, people are struggling. So there are a lot of issues here. A lot of issues, which means that conflicts, which of course linked with climate, the catastrophe, linked with trade, linked with our global systems. So there's a big need for unpacking. And when you say, when the COVID struck, suddenly the prices of all these issues, all these components, be it fertilizer, be it seeds, be it wheat or rice, shot up, because now we are in a global system and there is not enough autonomy. So a global system that benefits the few, that benefits the rich, but makes the common people more dependent and more vulnerable, not only for food, but also for the ability, for the resilience. 200 years ago, when the Ireland was struck with the potato famine, the famine took place because of blight, because there were only 4 species of potatoes in Ireland. And so when we have less biodiversity, we are more susceptible. So there are various issues here. So let's now dig deep into these points. And the first panelist today is Reverend Herbert M. Brown, the Executive Director of the Black Food Security Network. Reverend Dr. Brown has been a catalyst for personal transformation and social change for more than 20 years. For nearly 14 years, he served as pastor of the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, where he launched the Orator's Cross Freedom School, an educational program that celebrates Black heritage and develops hands-on skills in youth. He later launched the Black Church Food Security Network, which advances food security and food sovereignty by co-creating Black food ecosystems anchored by Black congregations in partnership with Black farmers and others. His work has garnered numerous awards and national recognition. He serves on the board of many impactful organizations such as Bread for the World, and is currently writing his first book entitled Nothing More Sacred: Radical Stories of Black Church, Faith, Food, and Freedom. I welcome you, Reverend Brown.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to all of you who are joining in this conversation on today. I will be speaking about the Black Church Food Security Network and the work that we do here, not only in Baltimore, Maryland, but across the United States. I guess I want to start with doing some definitions and speaking about food sovereignty in particular. Food sovereignty is defined as the right of peoples to healthy, in culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. This definition is provided by La Via Campesina, an international organization of farmers and landowners and peasants and those who are concerned about our food systems and concerned about community and concerned about the nature of our world as well. This is a part of the North Star of what we embrace as a definition and what helps to shape and provide clarity for the work that we do in the Black Church Food Security Network. Our organization thinks about food as a runway to justice, food as a runway to healing, and not just food as a way to create a system around it for profits and profit alone. And when we think about Black food sovereignty in particular, we start by thinking about how people of African descent in this country have an ancient relationship with farming and with agriculture and with the natural environment. And while some would want to believe that the relationship of the Black community and farming starts with slavery, history lets us know that people of African descent have had very advanced and sophisticated agricultural systems anywhere from 3000 BCE to 5000 BCE on the African continent. That notwithstanding, in the years following the Civil War, people of African descent bought land or were provided land and owned 15 million acres after the Civil War in these United States. But by 1920, there were 925,000 Black-owned farms in this country. And just in the span between 1920 and 1975, that dropped down to 45,000 Black-owned farms. And now, African Americans only make up 1% of the nation's rural land owners. That's a very steep decline in land ownership and stewardship, which is why we believe that justice has to be a part of the equation when you're talking about food security and food sovereignty and standing against violence of all kinds. Here are some of the reasons as to why and how Black people lost land or land was taken: pervasive federal discrimination, heir property conflicts, lack of access to affordable and trustworthy legal services, racial terrorism, literally being run off of our land, and more. With that in mind, I'm reminded of a quote by someone named Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. Many people who know of her because of her involvement in the civil rights movement. She was a voting rights activist and organizer. However, before she was an activist for voting rights, she was a farmer. And listen to what she says about food. She said, food is used as a political weapon. But if you have a pig in your backyard and some vegetables in your garden, you can feed yourself and your family and nobody can push you around. She was clearly providing a very sophisticated analysis of how food works in systems that are arrested by violence and have an appetite for violence. Even food is used as a weapon. Some might ask, how is this so? Well, in many of our communities, when you have more corner stores than you have places to get nutrient-rich produce, that's violent, because those communities are developed that way, planned that way, when there are corner stores and not places to get nutrient-rich food. And so this is part of the violence that she's talking about. And many religious groups over the past century have been engaged in addressing the violence of food apartheid. And that's the term that many of us in food justice movements use now. We don't say food desert because deserts many times are a natural part of the ecological landscape. We say food apartheid to point to the intentional ways that communities are developed with distance from nutrient rich food. Black communities being developed at distance from nutrient rich food. These are some of the religious organizations, the Christian groups, the African American Christian ministries that did something more than just engage in food charity, but develop with an asset-based community development model, food security and food sovereignty initiatives. Father Divine, Mother Divine, and the Peace Mission Movement is one such group. During the Great Depression, their church bought farmland in upstate New York, grew their own food, and then transported their food from the rural parts of New York State into New York City and sold their produce and other goods at their own stores and provided feasts at their own religious gatherings. To do this during the Great Depression was a testament to the power of their faith and fortitude to roll up their sleeves and lean and stand in the power of their faith to create their own system as a counter to the system of racism in the food system. Not only did they engage in such a ministry, but the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, also active in the early 1900s, similarly had a food program and a farming program. In fact, they had a farm in Oregonia, Ohio, and they grew their own foods, had their own grocery stores, and organized amongst the African American masses to get in the driver's seat of creating their own food environments. Bishop Ida Robinson, the first woman bishop in the United States, who left out of her church to start her own church and denomination, which called the Mount Sinai Holy Church of America. This Black women-led Christian denomination bought 140 acres of land in southern New Jersey and created this farm where people could leave the city and literally come out to their farm for respite, for rest, and to also reset. It was in the spirit of mental health. And in fact, many of you have heard about self-care these days. Well, back in the 1930s and 1940s, Bishop Robinson and her church bought a farm so that Northern African Americans would have a place for self-care away from the concrete and sirens of the city. Moving right along, another person that we lift up is Reverend Vernon Johns. He was a pastor, a seminary president, a brilliant preacher, and also a farmer. He was the predecessor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was a predecessor of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before Dr. King became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Church, Reverend Vernon Johns was the pastor, and he led their church in having a food initiative where Reverend Johns himself would sell produce on the front porch of the church after morning service on Sundays. He was trying to make sure that his congregation and community had not just access, but agency with respect to their food environment as well. I'll pick up the pace in interest of time, but even beyond Christian communities, the Nation of Islam here in the United States also has a rich and deep farming legacy. In the 1960s, they acquired 5,000 acres of land in Georgia and began growing their own food. And on their newspaper in their denomination and religion, they started to write article upon article about the importance of growing our own food and getting the nutrient-rich produce that we needed. They also had supermarkets and commercial aspect of their efforts that aligned with their religious practice. Civic organizations, community groups, and grassroots efforts like the Black Panther Party also had a food program. Their free breakfast program for children was so powerful and impactful that even the United States government copied their program And that's how we get free breakfast programs in the public schools of the United States. It was because of the leadership of the Black Panther Party and their efforts with children and breakfast. Finally, Reverend Albert Clegg of the Shrine of the Black Madonna led his church in the 1980s in acquiring nearly 4,000 acres of farmland in western South Carolina. I'm just getting back from their farm. On 2 days ago, I was there to see their massive land holdings and also hear about their plans to grow their operation even more in a way to advance food sovereignty and not just charity. All of these histories and more came in handy when I started pastoring my church, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. It's in the bottom right corner of the screen. I pastored there for 14 years, and during my time, I saw many members of my church being hospitalized repeatedly for diet-related issues. Well, I crossed the main intersection that's on your screen, and I went to this fresh food market that's in the top left corner of the screen, thinking that I could pipeline nutrient-rich food from that store to my church to stop this unhealthy cycle in my congregation. But economic barriers and cultural divides prevented us from establishing a partnership. And so instead of partnering outside of our church, I turned to the land that our church already owned. And it wasn't even that much. This is the land that's been next to our front door of our church that we've owned for a very long time. And while I'd seen this land a ton of times, on a particular day, frustrated by food apartheid in my community, I saw and received a vision to start growing food on our own land. And that's just what we did. I went to the congregation and shared the vision, and we transformed that lot into this today. 1,500 square feet of a garden. We grow 1,200 pounds of produce and partner with others as well to make sure that our community and our neighbors and congregation receive the support that they need with nutrient-rich food. As I close, I lift up the inspiration for this great work at our church. It's not only the history that inspires us toward food sovereignty, but this woman right here, Maxine Nicholas, who is one of the seniors of the church, who grew up in the American South on a farm, moved north during the Great Migration, and brought all of that farming wisdom with her. She helped us to grow our garden. And what I realized was that this woman was not just a dynamic leader at our church, but she also was the profile of the kind of members that you'll find in all African American churches. The people who know about farming, land, and the food, and can pull it all together. Inspired by all of this, we launched out to establish a national organization called the Black Church Food Security Network. We co-create Black food ecosystems anchored by Black churches in partnership with Black farmers and accomplices. We're located around the United States, most of our member churches being on the East Coast. We help churches start gardens on their land. We help churches to host farmers markets featuring Black farmers. We take congregations on Black farm tours. And our latest initiative is we've established a fruit tree orchard program. We just put in our first fruit tree orchard at one of our member churches in Jacksonville, Florida. 50 citrus trees. We're growing our own lemons, oranges, tangerines, and more. Our next orchard will be here in the Baltimore metro area that will have peaches. And we have an orchard coming in Buffalo, New York, that will have apples. We're connecting all of these churches and farmers together to co-create the kind of system that we need that furthers food sovereignty and not charity or begging or subjugation to systems that advance racism in our food system. And we invite partnership and connection on any of these things. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Reverend Herbert Brown. Fantastic, fantastic. I mean, this is really, really thought-provoking. It moves us. And he really set the stage by saying that food is the runway for justice. And what we are lacking is lack of justice, lack of food linked to lack of systemic challenges by which land is grabbed, food is grabbed, and leading us to food apartheid. Where do we look? We look to our scriptures. Of course, we look to our ancestors. For ancestors of long ago, ancestors of recent past, the mothers and fathers who show that it can work. We look to what we have. You look around our people, our lands, and find solutions. And most important, we work together. We work together. Thank you so much. We will come to discussions later. Now we go into the next panelist. Julie Bautista is the domestic policy analyst of Bread for the World. Julie was born in the Philippines and raised in Guam. Her lived experience in an island rich with indigenous cultures drove her to pursue a career in advocacy for historically marginalized groups and immigrant communities. She graduated from the University of Virginia and was selected in the 28th class of the Emerson National Hunger Fellows. For her field placement, she worked with the indigenous food and agricultural initiatives in Arkansas, where she developed educational resources to empower tribal leaders and Indian country through food sovereignty, agriculture, and economic development. Julie is currently a domestic policy analyst for Bread for the World in Washington, D.C., where she leads her engagement with indigenous farmers and advocates for policies that take into a broader food system challenges in the Farm Bill. These previous projects, she has committed to making an attempt to center the focus on those who are on the periphery and advocate for economic and human rights. We are so grateful that she is there in Washington, D.C., connecting up with the great work that is happening in the periphery. Welcome to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manoj, for that introduction, and I'm so honored to be here. So I guess I'll start off by saying, when I started getting into this field of Indigenous studies and advocacy, one thing that really resonated with me and my faith was the principle of interconnectedness that a lot of Indigenous brothers and sisters practice. And it simply means that we are all interconnected in our energies, and humans do not have dominion over the land or nature. And this really aligns with the theme of this conference, with swords and plowshares into plowshares. It calls us to heed Christ's call and gather as one body as our faith wants us to recognize that we are one with the Lord and one with our neighbor and one with nature. And so I'm really, really grateful for this invitation of having me here speak about issues of Indigenous communities, but also how our faith aligns with these principles, which is more the reason as to why we should advocate with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I wanted to start off by saying that scientifically and historically and faithfully, this is a fact that when we exploit the land, it leads to negative impacts in our way of life. Dr. Manoj talked about it earlier, how there is tremendous greed currently in society. And although we have a lot of resources, a lot of people are going hungry. And exploitation of the land, especially militarization, leads to pollution and climate change, which then impacts health and human flourishing. And, that cycle goes on. I grew up on the island of Guam, and 30% of its total land area is occupied by a U.S. military base. Currently, there is no meat processing facility or a slaughterhouse on the island, which simply means that every time I ate meat when I was a child, it was imported, and locally raised meat is prohibited on the island, even though we have all this land to produce food for resources for our people. This is a problem because Indigenous communities have the land, yet they don't have access to it, and people are going hungry. We have a system that only values domination of the land, and that's why militarization receives so much money, is because we want to make sure we keep the land. But what we need to realize is that food security is global security, and if people are hungry and struggling, we really don't have anything to be proud of, because if we can't even reach that minimum decency of having people fed, it's really it's really pointless of everything that we've worked for. And so this is similar to what's happening in Native American reservations. While many Native Americans have millions of acres of lands, the very food produced, raised, and grown on the lands do not stay within the communities to feed their people. There are several agricultural policy barriers and financial structures, such as predatory landing, that hinders the success of indigenous people in producing food in their own land. They cannot feed their people, and instead the system leaves them with no choice but to lease it to corporations who exploit the land and promote mass production. And so how do we connect all these problems to a real policy solution? And so one of the Bread for the World's priorities on the Farm Bill is really partnering with Native organizations, including the Native Farm Bill Coalition, to identify policies that address this issue. And so one of them is really uplifting the 638 self-determination pilot project in the Farm Bill. And in the 2018 Farm Bill, this was passed as a pilot project, meaning it doesn't have mandatory funding. And so one of the things that we're currently pushing for this Farm Bill is that we receive mandatory funding and it is expanded. And 638 Authority is a law mandated in 1975 that allows federally recognized tribes to manage their own federal programs. So at first, this was implemented in the Department of Education, and then the Department of Interior, and the Department of Transportation. So it has shown how successful it is and how capable tribes are in managing their own resources. And so more recently, in the 2018 Farm Bill, they were given the chance to manage their own federal food assistance program, which is the federal distribution program on Indian reservation, food distribution program on Indian reservation. And the 638 FDIPR for short really allows tribes to manage funds and manage their own programs while sourcing all the food in these food boxes, sourcing them from local producers and local farmers and stimulating their local economy. So there were 8 tribes that were awarded this grant, and it generated $3 million back into the economy. And like I mentioned, it secures economic stability. It stimulates local economy because it is sourced from local farmers and our producers. And so, but not only that, it also ensures that we have agricultural sustainability. As we allow our Native siblings to be the stewards of the land, we know that it will be well taken care of because they have been stewards of the land for a millennia of years. And Reverend Brown was actually talking about this earlier when he mentioned that, people of African descent have always had sophisticated and advanced farming techniques and practices. And there is a growing recognition for indigenous farming practices as well in this field. And the more we allow them to steward our land, there is a higher chance for us to have regenerative and a sustainable food system. And finally, I wanted to close this out by, merely just acknowledging how the past and the present violence against indigenous communities really impacts self-determination. I think for many Native traditions, they were historically feared and misinterpreted as a sin rather than understood as cultural expressions, leading to a deeper understanding of our Creator and its creation. And they were faithfully vehicles for the grace and the knowledge of God. And they, such fears really resulted into persecution and discrimination and marginalization of Native people by the church. And I think we must continue to learn more about the complicity of and the roles of our church in playing the dehumanization of indigenous people. especially as it relates to, death in Indian boarding schools and ecological damages that was done in Indian country. But I think this is a perfect setting for us to, turn away from those patterns of this age that includes patterns of domination and overconsumption and individualism that really ignores the common good, but instead really focusing on our similarities with our indigenous brothers and sisters in terms of interconnectedness, how we connect, how we are one with nature, with God, with our siblings from other races and other churches, and perhaps even other parties that we identify with. So that is all. Thank you so much, Dr. Manoj, for that introduction again, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. This is also very powerful. And what is very thought-provoking is we have moved from a community, the African American community, whose ancestors were stolen from the mother continent, and who were brought and enslaved and when they, out of their hard work and their culture, worked on the land, there were systems that dispossessed them further. And through the couple of centuries, they have lost out, and now they have less than 1% of land holdings. But on the contrary, now Julius actually introduced us to the Native American populations, the indigenous communities, who actually own a lot of land, but systems and policies prevent them from fully benefiting from it. So you see, the greed of humanity is such that where people do, the land and food and policies are used are perverted, and justice is perverted. And this is not only happening in North America or in the United States. If you look at the globe, nearly 53%, no, sorry, 25% of all land on the earth is actually taken care of by indigenous communities, and they are only 5% of the population. And they hold about 53% of all biodiversity in the land. But indigenous communities and native populations are facing tremendous challenges throughout the world. And so here, what we find, what Bread for the World and people like Julie are doing, are hitting out at the policies and showing that policy transformation does change and can help us to bring back justice. Thank you for that. Now we'll go into our next resource person and speaker, Karen Bigelow, who is the co-executive director of the Creation Justice Ministries. Karen is she formerly worked at Bread for the World, focusing on the intersections of climate change and food security. She is a member of the American Baptist Church's Creation Justice Network. She earned her master's in divinity from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and undergraduate degree from the Michigan State University. She is currently pursuing a Master of Sciences in global food security, focusing her studies and research on sustainability at the University of Edinburgh. She is a board member of the DC Food Panel Council under the administration of Mayor Muriel Bowser. Karen is also a trained beekeeper. So you have a practitioner, a policymaker, and of course, a learner who is learning and expanding her knowledge. We look forward to your input, Karen.
Thank you. Apologies, I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen. I'm going to stop sharing, but apologies, I'll try to be as illustrious as possible in talking about my presentation. Thank you so much for having me today to be able to talk about sustainability, climate change, what that means for our agriculture, as well as talking about what that means for race and environmental justice. And so bear with me as I try to hold a few different topics at the same time. And so for me, what I want to talk about today is the issue of food systems and climate change to start off with. I want to talk about how climate change and our food system have a reciprocal relationship with each other. Our food system, due to practices the mainly around the f- our food system mainly apologies our food system has impacts on climate. It creates a lot of environmental degradation, as well as there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that happen due to our current food system, mainly in industrial farming. And then not only that, but then climate in returns causes havoc on our food system through drought, extreme heat, natural disasters, and other events that can happen that then really have an impact on our food system, because when it comes to our agricultural system, it is, as you know, very dependent upon the outside elements. And so climate change really threatens and makes it harder to be able to grow food. And so when it comes to food system and climate change, ways that the food system impacts climate change is through not only greenhouse gas emissions, as I just mentioned, but also through the production of food waste. Food waste is a huge problem in not just our country, but also our world when it comes to the waste that happens on the farm, in transportation, at the grocery store or restaurant, and then also from us as consumers often. And so when it comes to our food system, there is so much food waste that happens. And as that food waste breaks down the emissions releases into the environment, as well as we see the water, the labor, the soil, all those natural resources that happen are then become an issue for um, pretty much being wasted. And so not only are we wasting on the back end, but then that's water and other resources that could have also been used. And so just to give a context about how big of the issue is when it comes to our food system, there can be estimates of anywhere from 21 to 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions being attributed to our food system. And so this is not a small problem. This is a quarter of the issues that are happening, and so, or more. And so, because of that, our food system shows not only the importance of addressing it so that we can cure climate change, but it also probably shows a lot of promise that can happen in the process. And so, when it comes to climate change and how it impacts our food system, we see that happens again through higher temperatures. We see changes in precipitation, rain. We see that climate change is causing through extreme heat, lower crop yields. We also find that extreme events such as hurricanes and deep frosts also are causing us to have an issue where food at sometimes can't even be grown for weeks or months to come. And so this is all impacting how our food system is, and we're finding that food security, because of this, will increasingly in fact be affected by future climate change, and that has an impact not only currently, but we also expect then that food prices will rise. We already see it now, where if supply goes down due to a climate event, we find that the supply being lower means that food prices rise. And so, because of that, we also know that that happens when it comes to major crops. And unfortunately, that means that it has a impact on everyone, but especially those that are already struggling to put food on the table. And so, because of the the impact of climate change, we anticipate that by 2050, cereal prices for cereal grains, anything that would include wheat, can go up as high as 29% in food prices by 2050 on the global market. And all of this leads to more impacts on communities that are already facing higher food security rates, that are already facing chronic health issues that are related to diet, such as diabetes, high cholesterol, blood pressure, anything that can be kind of either mitigated or supported through a healthy diet is often being further complicated through higher food prices and the lack of access that can happen after natural disasters happen. And so, sustainable agriculture and environmental justice are intrinsically connected to each other. And the injustice that happens is also connected. And so we find that through industrial agriculture, it requires an intensive use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. There's an average of 2 million tons of pesticide used annually to be able to address weeds, insects, and pests. Because often industrial farms use monoculture, they use tilling, things that are not natural for the planet, and so therefore there is often a use of chemicals in order to try to manipulate and mimic nature in that way. And so our food system as it currently stands does not protect the environment, it does not protect human health, and it doesn't produce enough nutritious food, nor does our food system distribute it equitably in the US or around the world. And so sustainability and justice, they are connected. And because they are connected, this is in due part because injustice and environmental degradation is also connected to our food system. And so, what we find is that when it comes to environmental injustice, we find that even on farms, communities can be poisoned. We also see labor issues when it comes to farm workers. Migrant farm workers are more at risk of health issues related to extreme heat, related to exposure to chemicals, related to just wildfires and being exposed to unclean air. And we even see when it comes to communities and being exposed to, and not just communities, but also the rest of creation, being exposed to runoff of these pesticides. Washington state alone has more than 2,000 polluted waters listed in the area where agriculture is the primary land use for any activity of land. And out of the outputs that come from industrial farming and unsustainable agriculture is, of course, climate change, biodiversity loss. We see poverty happening in rural areas at a higher level. We see water scarcity, especially in the West. We see diet related diseases happening. We see food safety and food waste happening. And so, as we look at this issue, we know that all of these things are connected and there's consequences for everyone, but especially for those who are low income as well as BIPOC communities. And so, climate change often then serves as a multiplier, not just in our food system, but in our communities for racial inequities. And so, policies and practices around climate have historically discriminated against excluded BIPOC communities due to structural racism, and communities of color bear the negative impacts at higher rates. And so what we find is that all of these things of racial injustice that people experience is unfortunately being compounded due to climate change. And we found this in our research due to four main areas. Um, the racial wealth gap divide makes BIPOC communities more vulnerable to food insecurity. Um, Living in racial housing segregation, a lack of investment in many of these communities, and racialized concentrated poverty makes people more vulnerable to climate change and food insecurity. We also find that racial health inequities and social determinants make people more susceptible to these issues. And also, as has already been mentioned, a lack of sovereignty in communities. This is the case for Indigenous communities, but also for other Black and Brown communities that do not have the ability to really have self-determination for their communities and what should happen. And so, and lastly, just to bring in, what does this mean for militarization? Often the component that is often forgot about in when it comes to food security is that there has to be stability. People should have access to safe and nutritious food at all times. And stability is the part that really makes it harder and where climate change really shows itself mostly, because when people are exposed to natural disasters, when people are exposed to violence and other things, it makes it hard to address the vulnerability that people have to hunger. And this is becoming worse and worse of an issue. We have done a great job globally at being able to cut world hunger, extreme hunger in half. And yet we have found over the last 5 years that the numbers keep rising, unfortunately. We're undoing that work that we've done because one of the main reasons being climate change and also armed conflict. And unfortunately, a lot of that armed conflict often has origins over climate related issues. And so, issues around access to water, access to food, things that are happening in countries where they are hit by climate issues even worse than we are in a US context, often they are exposed to these issues, and it starts off with a water crisis, and then over years it builds up to something more. And so what we're finding is that as people are subject to less access to food, people are seeing vulnerability. Often this is the thing that's then causing conflict. And so as a people of peace, in order for us to see peace, in order for us to see justice, we have to address this issue of food security and its connections to climate and sustainability issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. We have, with this, the presentation from Karen, really bringing up the issue of systemic problems with our agriculture and how we manage land. About, as Rashida mentioned, that industrial and farm, in the discussion, she said those two word doesn't mesh. But that's what we are doing. We are promoting a system which is so unnatural, which needs so much of pesticides, so much of fertilizers, so much of artificial input, that ultimately it can be maintained only by the very, very rich. And of course, she really pointed that sustainability and justice is linked, sustainability and peace is linked. And of course, food, just to remind you that 70% of all available water, 40% of all available land is used to produce food. If we don't produce food in a sustainable and a life-giving manner, then we are actually already contributing a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions because of food. And to top it all, a third of all food produced is wasted. As many of you have observed. But also reiterating the issue of violence and arms. Imagine why are people in sub-Saharan Africa risking their lives to cross the Sahara, to be exposed to human trafficking, rape, and personal violence? Why are people in Latin America, you're seeing the news, why they are walking through forests in Panama, risking their lives, children and families walking towards the United States. Why are people doing that? It's because the systems in these countries have become so destroyed because of the global system that people are looking to the United States, people are looking to Europe for salvation. But we who live in Europe and the United States, we know that it is not heaven. And so the situation in many of these countries are even worse. And of course, huge amounts of arms being produced now from the United States. You see the problems of small arms and the violence because of guns, but a lot of these are exported to other countries, especially in Latin America and Central America, and in return for drugs. And so you have huge amount of change movements. So countries are packed with guns and ammunition, and it actually adds oil to the flames of violence. And of course, they're producing and transporting more drugs and a lot of criminality. So all this produces situations where it is unsafe for families to live in the rural areas. 70% of agriculture is now being handled by women. It's not because there are no men, because the men have gone to the urban areas, but only 20% of the land is in the name of the woman. So you have a lot of gender injustice in these issues. So we have concluded a very, very wonderful powerful session with a variety of input. Now, we have about 18 minutes remaining in this session. I invite questions. So in the Q&A, and so that we can put it forward to our experts. There are two questions have come. The initial question was from Kyle Evans. Land security is a significant issue in Philadelphia. Do you work with urban partners and political leaders in raising awareness about the importance of urban farms? So that's the first question. And the second question you already can read. Globalization threatens food security. That's from Angel Luis Rivera. Globalization threatens food security, sovereignty through transgenics, co-opting land and selling one-time crop to farmers worldwide, among other issues. How are you dealing with these challenges posed by actual depreciatory trade? So I put these questions. Who would you all three colleagues are online? Who would like to handle one of these questions?
Well, I can say very quickly. I appreciate this conversation. The presentations have been fantastic. I'm particularly thankful for the ways in which we've heard both an inside and outside approach when it comes to advocacy. I think sometimes the focus on advocacy can just sometimes be inside or outside. But I think we've come to the place where we don't have the luxury of either or organizing. And so when it comes to the Black Church Food Security Network, we do work with churches in the urban centers, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Buffalo, Jacksonville, Florida, go on down the line. And our work, though, focuses on organizing those who are most directly affected by food apartheid and food insecurity. And so ours is not an organization of representatives who may speak on behalf of constituencies, but more so those who are feeling the pangs of apartheid directly themselves. I think that can, like a hand in the glove, fit very well with the dynamic work that organizations like Bread for the World and so many others do, important work on the Hill, so that you have a real force and constituency that's ready to not only go to the Hill, but also take it home and organize their local communities as well. That's what I'll offer up on that.
Anyone else would like to offer on the urban farms point?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, it was clear. It's about the issue of land, and in the urban areas, how are we maximizing it? Do you know how can we use the land in the urban areas, accessing land for cultivation? Can you give examples or pointers?
Yes, I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening, and we've seen that including with agencies like USDA. They are making investments to really support urban agriculture as well as many cities are. We see people looking into exploration of how do you do rooftop farming. We also see vertical farms happening, and so we're starting to figure out how to better use the space, and not necessarily the land, but the space, the square footage that we can have access to that may not necessarily always be the soil per se. And so there is innovation that's happening in that way. And many churches are also, as we've already heard, are figuring out how to then be stewards of the land that they have for their properties. And so that's something that is definitely happening, especially as many cities are starting to figure out how to localize their food systems, especially after the Glasgow Declaration, around cities really making a commitment to more localized food systems and reducing food waste as well.
The other examples which I can give from the United States and also in many parts of the world is actually trying to get land that is fallow, that's not used, or part of public property which can be leased out to schools, to clubs, to groups, community groups, so they can farm, like demonstration. So that is also happening, building shared, spaces, which is not owned, but they're managed for sharing resources. Shall we go into the next, Julie? If you can, we go into the next point properly, because we can get more questions answered. We have.
Yeah, did you want me to answer the globalization question, Dr. Manoj?
Yes,
I can,
please.
yeah.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I can start us off. Like we talked about earlier, globalization, which capitalism and consumerism all interconnected, really significantly influences the economy, ecology in very negative ways, possibly positive in the economic side, but mostly, damaging for our ecological side. So the most prominent issues that Karen talked about was climate change and environmental degradation. And so now there is an urgent need to localize, and really promoting, local food systems and economies suggests an increase in resilience and really improves the environmental footprint of agricultural production. And so, that is really something that we need to emphasize. I think we should start to shift away from globalization to localization. And really, when we think about kind of what policies are on the table right now that we can advocate for, like I mentioned, the 638 food distribution program is a small step to that for Native American reservations, but really making sure that these tribes are the one managing their own programs and managing their own food, and sourcing from their own farmers and their own producers and farmers. And so if that model is kind of copied throughout America, hopefully, that would significantly really increase the agricultural footprint, and better have a better environmental
Yeah. It's it's what is so important is that we are aware of what the things that we buy, where are we getting it from, and recently, there was a fire in a dairy farm in the United States. I don't know whether you read the news. Can you guess how many cows died in that fire? In that one farm, it was in the news, which I read in BBC. Anyone? One farm, 18,000 cows in one fire. So you can imagine it's such intensive farm, cramped up, and it was due to a methane leak. It is pathetic that, and when you say why are we in such a mess globally? Because there is a war in Ukraine and Russia. It's because of globalization. 40% of sunflower oil comes from Ukraine and Russia. Huge proportion of fertilizers and nitrogen fertilizers come from Ukraine and Russia. So why are we in this situation? I come from Asia, and and if there is a problem shipped from Indonesia, shipping palm oil globally, oil prices go up. But why do we all have to take palm oil and sunflower oil? And so we have to think, of course, it does mean that we'll have to pay more sometimes, because policies are skewed to support industrial farming. So this is the problem. So even if we want to eat healthy, it is very expensive. So we have to start questioning. And Kyle has raised the issue of how communities try to take land, but it was being dispossessed again by authorities. The struggles are huge. But we have to understand that, when as Christians and as great religious movements, they all started small, and always struggle against injustice is tough, and we need to get together, and we cannot be defeated. We have to keep striving, and this whole event is also an example of how we are bringing together these wonderful experiences and knowledge that is there present in the community. So there are questions. Joanne is asking you, Reverend Brown, where can we find Black food security farms? And so there's a thirst, and I think if you can share the web link, you go into. I mean, this is a wonderful network practically happening, and of course we have to now figure out have coalition between communities who are pushed to the margins. So it's not only black and brown communities or indigenous communities. It's also the dispossessed among the so-called privileged communities. So actually, the people who actually are privileged are very small. So we are the issue is we are in varying degrees of dispossession. So we have to develop a solidarity between the different groups of people. And we have to really see ourselves as a ummah, as one body, as so when there is a one body, and all religions talk about this, about one body. But imagine if you are one body, if one hand is on the fire and the other is in water, can you say that the body is on average fine? It is not. It is not. So whatever the race, whatever the ethnic group, if people are hungry, we cannot, close our eyes. And it is so very important, and that is why in the Beatitudes it starts with one of the about blessed are those who mourn. It talks about stepping outside our comfort zone because there is suffering. This very moment, children are being abused. This very moment, there's a child who's going hungry. This very moment, there are people who are going to bed starving, and many of these people don't ask. People in need may not actually ask. We have to have the empathy to actually discern the need. We have to step outside our comfort zone. We have to mourn because in a world so full of resources, that we are still having hungry people, and so we have to figure out who is in need. So I think we're coming to the end, and I would actually give you a minute or two each, if you can actually give some concluding words. Can we start with Kylie? Karen.
Yeah, sure. I would just say, one, thank you for having me. I think the most important thing that we can talk or walk away with is understanding that all of these issues are interconnected, whether it's about nutrition, equity, environmental justice, sustainability, and our food system. They're all interconnected. And at the end of the day, we really need to, as people of faith, stand with our Indigenous brothers and sisters to then fight for sovereignty, to do that also in BIPOC communities at large as well, and to be able to look at these issues and understand that in order for us to seek or see an end to hunger one day, we have to look at the environmental issues. We have to look at racial justice issues. These things cannot happen in a vacuum. And so as faith communities, we have a responsibility to do all of these things and to work on all of them. And so we have to approach this from an intersectional lens.
Julie.
Yeah, I would like to echo everything that Karen just to say. I am really honored to be here with Reverend Brown and Karen in the same space, and Dr. Manoj. Thank you so much.
Reverend Herbert Brown.
Thank you so much for this opportunity as well. I'll just say this is a gargantuan task, but as people of faith, we have a holy book full of stories of small groups of faith-filled people who came together to knock down the giants in our way. Listen, this is a giant. I stepped down from pastoring my church a year ago to devote myself full time to advancing food justice. That's how urgent this is. This is an all-in moment. The great and beautiful thing is that there is progress being made on all fronts. Specifically to the work that I'm doing, I'm just remembering that in the mid-20th century, African-American Christians helped to marshal, form, and lead a civil rights movement that resulted in every community benefiting from our courage and our leadership. I really do believe that the work that we're doing in the Black Church Food Security Network is a part of that same tradition of the Black freedom struggle. And I'm putting my whole life in it. I'm all in on that. And I'm grateful to be in partnership with each of you as we lead this massive movement from the grassroots to Capitol Hill to advance food justice, to fight for small farmers and for our families, and know that there's nobody else coming to save us. But that's okay, because our Bible teaches us that we have someone within us that gives us the strength that we need to move forward. God bless you all, and thank you so much.
Thank you, all the three resource persons, and of course, most importantly, the 110 people who are logged on. I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge, and we would love to hear from you, and you have collated more of this information, and the solutions are within our own context, and it's amazing that you are here. We thank you for your time, and I would hand over to the organizers the last minute so they can give some concluding words.
Well, good afternoon. What a powerful session we have just had. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Charmaine Taylor, the EAD coordinator, and I'm just going to quickly give you some information. Thanks again, first of all, Dr. Curran, as well as Julie and Karen and Dr. Brown for that bringing in all of those elements that make a difference. As you've mentioned, it's a gargantuan task. And I love what was said about the fact that we have to not only be external advocates, but also internal advocates as well. And I know that everyone in our audience will agree to that. So EAD advocates can be better equipped to be ground forces for justice and equity in the pursuit of this food security. But we're not done yet. There's much, much more in store for today and tomorrow. The Ask Plenary takes place here on the main stage at 4 p.m. following this next block 2 of our issue workshops from 3 to 3:45. And we hope everyone, even those not planning to join us on the Hill tomorrow, will attend to learn more about our asks. Thank you again for everyone who joined us. And yes, there are one of the beauties of this conference is that every session is recorded. And so all of some 500 people who have registered will get a chance to hear this message at their leisure over the next 30 days so that we can mobilize even more people for these causes that are so important to us. But we're going to take them to the Hill tomorrow. So we'll see you back here soon at 4 p.m. Enjoy the next sessions. And thank you again to our distinguished panel and to our team that is working so hard behind the scenes, volunteers, as well as our production team at Perisphere. And we'll see you back here at 4 o'clock.